Well, greetings. This is the introduction part two, if you will, for week two of history 3123, church history two. And um, the last video, I briefly just kind of touched on Ulrich Zwingli and the Anabaptists, right? The radical reformers. And so, a couple of other things I want to talk about for kind of a weekly introduction for you. And the second one would be John Calvin. All right, now everybody knows who John Calvin is. John Calvin is like Martin Luther. He's that other name that everybody recognizes. So this week you'll be reading and looking at some material about John Calvin from chapter 7. Now, when you think of Reformed theology, there are two individuals that you need to think of. Okay, well, three. Martin Luther, for one, but he is going to be Lutheran, all right, after his own name. So there's a difference between Lutheran churches and the Reformed churches. Okay, just realize that the Lutheran churches they reformed, they changed some things, but they kept some things. Okay, from the ancient church that some people think is popish or Roman Catholic like. They kept some things within the Lutheran churches. The Reformed churches under Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, they continued to remove some things, especially under Zwingli. All right, Calvin kept some stuff. Zwingli got rid of most. All right, so just know that there's a difference when we think of the Reformed churches. There's really kind of three categories there. You got the Reformed Lutheran churches, you've got the Reformed that are kind of more Calvin, and then you got the Reformed that are more Zwingli. All right, so let's look at that. A lot of people look at John Calvin as the kind of the father of the Reformed Protestant Christianity. Now, he doesn't start the Reformation, right? But Calvin, and especially more so his followers, are going to they're going to be responsible for providing some key characteristics of the Reformed movement. Okay, and so Calvin basically says he wants to start. Basically, he wants to start from scratch, right? For the most part, his doctrinal reforms didn't necessarily want to modify some of the lingering Roman Catholic theology. He wanted to kind of get rid of a lot of it, okay? So he wants to take a little bit of a different direction. And you're going to see a great attempt made at this in his magnum opus called the Institutes of Christian Religion. Okay, it was his systematic theology that he produced of his own, and it was just a great, profound work. Now, Calvin, he is basically he had a master's in theology, and he goes on to become he studied law. Again, going to see some things that are very similar to some other famous historical theologians. But he studies law for a little bit to kind of appease his father. But he studies theology, gets a graduate degree in theology, and he's going to continue and going to leave France. And at some point he goes back to France, but he spends some time in Switzerland. So we say John Calvin because it's kind of the English rendering of his name, but his name is French because he's a French theologian, hung out with the Swiss a lot, and so you're going to see his influences broadly, right? You're going to see it in France, you're going to see it in England, you're going to see it in Switzerland, you'll see a little bit of it in Germany. So very broad. And so his work, the Institute of Christian Religions, is kind of a staple of Reformed theology. If you've never read it, you need to look into it. It's required reading in graduate and doctoral programs. And you need to at least kind of dip your head in. And in fact, there may be an assignment or two where you might have to be exposed to looking up something that he would say in this course. So again, his theology is based on the fact that, hey, he's a lawyer and he knows how to argue. Okay, he studied law. He knows what he wants to say, and he's going to use logic in order to lay out his argument, and he's going to be really good at it. Just like Ulrich Zwingli is going to go to Oh my goodness. Just like Zwingli is going to go to Zurich, sorry, just like Zwingli's going to go to Zurich, Calvin's going to go to Geneva. All right, and that's where his big influence is going to be felt. Um, within the Reformed movement. He is going to be going to Geneva. Got a pastor friend there that really kind of wants him to stay. He's read. He knows how talented he is. His friend Basil said, "Hey, I want you to stay here. Help me out. Let's reform the city, right? Let's just reform Geneva." And just like Zwingli was reforming Zurich, Calvin winds up reforming Geneva, and it becomes a kind of a big deal. And there is that cushy relationship that is established between the church and the state. Look into that this week in your reading. It does become a little problematic. Now, at the beginning, John Calvin's going to be kicked out because of his views, because he's trying to change a lot. Again, Geneva was very Roman Catholic when it starts out. So they kick him out. But they realize a little bit later, hey, you know what? We made a mistake. We want you to come back and help us. So hey, in 1541, he comes back to Geneva, and he basically sets up a hierarchical system that is going to run the city, the church life and the city life, almost, if you will. And it was called the consistory. The consistory. Now, the consistory basically said, hey, we need to organize the church and organize the ministries according to pastors, teachers, elders, deacons, and they're going to have a lot of influence over not only the church life but also the city life. So just like Ulrich Zwingli is going to be connected with the Zurich City Council, Calvin's going to have a lot of push and pull with the City Council of Geneva. And so, Calvin's going to push some things, and he's going to very much influence the theology of the city. And eventually you're going to see them kind of they're going to shift from being more Roman Catholic, and they're going to be reformed of a Calvinist shade, if you will. One of the things that he does is that he removes statues and paintings from churches, just like Zwingli does out in Zurich. He is going to look for the plain and literal translation, plain and literal meaning within Scripture. He's going to preach a lot, right? The style of preaching that we know today really comes from someone like John Calvin. So most evangelical churches, where they get up and they preach for 30 minutes to an hour, that really kind of comes from Calvin, because he's going to be influencing what we call the grammatico-historical expository style of preaching, where expository is where basically you take a passage and you preach on it verse by verse, almost, if you will, and you're expositing verse by verse the truth that is within those verses. The Reformed churches tend to do this a lot. So some Reformed churches, actually, you have, for example, the Reformed Church, or you have like some Reformed Calvinistic type churches would be some Baptist churches and some Baptist denominations, for example. And so you're going to see a style of preaching that really is kind of known in the broad evangelical Christian world here in America. And he's going to push for the removal of icons and statues and within the churches. So that's an example of iconoclasm, okay? Iconoclasm, the removal, getting rid of icons, okay? For those of you that had Church History 1, remember one of the first 7 councils said, icons, statues are okay. They're windows into heaven. They help tell the story. But the rest of them did not. They disagreed with it. So there's a bunch of issues that basically happen, and you can really kind of point out Calvinists, because John Calvin said, you know what, we got to get rid of all this fancy dressing and all that kind of stuff. We need to be dressing a certain way. So he advocated plain clothes, and that's another kind of an influence of his. One of the things that happens, again, that church-state relationship, there's going to be a person within the city of Geneva that's really going to be condemned as a heretic, and they basically put him up on trial and killed him for his heresy. Now, I'm all for the fact that, heresy should not be spreading within the church. However, should the church and the state have such a relationship that the church can sit there and basically cause the arrest and the execution of someone who is dissenting, right? For example, In Switzerland with Zurich, you're going to have, remember, Zurich is going to be killing or arresting, and in some cases killing the Anabaptists because they have disagreements. Okay, and here in Geneva, you do have an example of one man. His name was Michael Servetus. Um, he's going to be killed because of his different beliefs. Now, there's some big things about Calvinism that you need to know, be familiar with, okay? Calvinism is going to be a huge thing. There's this thing, what we think of as like the 5 points of Calvinism, right? TULIP. Total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Now, those things Calvin didn't say, he didn't come up with the 5 points of Calvinism. Okay, now he had teaching and theology that said, okay, yes, I do believe in total depravity, I do believe in unconditional election, so on and so forth. He doesn't arranged it like that, right? In fact, tulip is the English arrangement. Okay, this would have been in at this point this would have been almost German and in some cases, and so we need to know that the Calvinism that we know today doesn't really come from John Calvin. The Calvinism that we know today comes from his followers. Okay, now there were some individuals that disagreed with Calvin, specifically a follower of Calvin who's going to be teaching at a university, and you're going to have another man by the name of Jacob Arminius, okay, Jacobus Arminius, who's going to be disagreeing with a Calvinist follower. Basically, this is a generation after Calvin, almost, and you're going to see them having disagreements, okay, and you're going to have the followers of Calvin that are going to be kind of taking this one step further, okay, they're taking Calvin's theology and taking it one step further, and you're going to have individuals like Jacob Arminius who says, listen, I'm a Calvinist at heart, but there's a couple things that I disagree with you guys on. And so they published something. Well, he had debates with some Calvinists at his university. And then when Arminius died, some of his followers took some of his teachings and writings and they published what's called the 5 Articles of Remonstrance. The 5 Articles of Remonstrance. And basically those 5 articles were I shouldn't say they weren't the complete opposite, but they were some competing interests. For example, the Articles of Remonstrance would say, the Arminians would say that, for example, while they do believe in total depravity, they do not believe in unconditional election, for example, or specifically limited atonement, right? That the atonement is for everybody, and it only takes effect if you respond to the call of salvation, right? The Calvinists would say, no, it's limited atonement. Christ didn't die for everybody. He only died for the elect, okay? So there's an example. Conditional election versus unconditional election, limited atonement versus unlimited atonement. The Arminians, right, they would say that you could resist the Holy Spirit. You could resist that draw, that tug where God is trying to lead you to accept him. The Calvinists would say, no, you can't, right? It's irresistible grace, right? The Arminians would say, no, it's resistible grace. You can resist God. And, for example, the perseverance of the saints, that's another issue. So the Arminians are the ones that kind of kick this ball rolling. They say, hey, these are 5 things that we do not agree with the Calvinists about. And so the Calvinists responded with what we know today in the American parlance as tulip, right? And so the Calvinists were just responding to what the Arminians did. Now, Southwestern Christian University is a Wesleyan Arminian institution. John Wesley, who we follow as from the revival of the holiness movement, the revival of the Methodist revivals that John Wesley kicks off. We are Wesleyan Arminians, okay? But you guys need to be familiar with the Calvinist system of theology, and you need to be familiar with the Arminian system of theology. So you're going to get exposed to that a little bit in this course, in this week during this course. Um, some things that I think you're going to look at within the course for this week. For example, what was Calvin's ecclesiology? What was his view on the sacraments? What was his view on, for example, the Eucharist or baptism? Okay, very interesting things. When you look at the views of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli, they're going to have different views when it comes to the Eucharist or communion, Lord's Supper, and baptism, especially Zwingli. Okay, Martin Luther and John Calvin they're kind of on the same side of the category. They have a little bit of slightly differences here, but Zwingli's way over here. Zwingli is a memorialist. He says, for example, no, the sacrament, the Lord's Supper, it's purely a symbolic reference where we're just remembering something. Calvin and Martin Luther would say there's something going on. God's grace is being communicated somehow. Okay, so familiarize yourself with that. In fact, I think some of your assignments this week are going to dive into that. One last thing to briefly mention is the Reformation in England. Now, we've last week we talked about the Reformation in Germany. This week you're talking about the Reformation in Switzerland. You're going to see it in both Zurich with Zwingli, but also Geneva with John Calvin. But it also happens in England. Now, this is one of my favorite topics because it actually leads, John Wesley came out of John Wesley never left the Church of England. He was a priest. He was an ordained priest in the Church of England. The Methodist movement came out of the American Methodist movement came out of the Church of England. The Methodists within England, they stayed with the Church of England through, because John Wesley never left, and most of the Methodists in England stayed with the Church of England. But you have a group of them that did come over here to the United States, and they, the colonies, in the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s, and they established the what we would call as the Methodist Episcopal Church. Okay, the United Methodist Church that we know today. Now, there's a lot to that. It had some splits and some other churches that started off. So there are several Methodist churches today. But the Church of England is a very interesting, fascinating topic for me. Number one, the Church of England has been around for a long time. Some people sit there and think, the Church of England is kind of a modern invention. It is not. There has been a church in England almost since the very beginning. Okay, there are historical records showing that there were, for example, you have Augustine of Canterbury goes from Rome to England, right? In the 4th, 5th century. You're going to see you're going to have Celtic Christianity that goes back even further than that. So there has been a church in England almost since the, 2nd century, into the 1st century, 2nd century. There's been a church in England for just as long as almost just as long as there's been a church in Rome. All right. Now, the one thing that you need to know about the English Reformation, this all kind of hinges on King Henry VIII. All right, King Henry VIII. Basically, you had some English reformers that are going to be popping up. You're going to have people that are going to be familiarizing themselves with Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and they're going to say, "Hey, we recognize that. Hey, the reformers and the other parts of Europe." They've got a point. They've got a good point. And so the Protestant Reformation is starting to take root in England. What really kicks it off, though, is a political situation. All right. You have King Henry VIII, Tudor, 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 and he was married to Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon was a daughter of the Spanish monarch, King and Queen Ferdinand and Isabella. Okay. Now, a lot that goes into that. In fact, there's several TV shows that have been made about this issue. Okay, for example, the Tudors. That's a show that you might. I think it's on Stars. I'm not really sure, but maybe on HBO. I don't remember. But anyway, that whole show was about what I'm getting ready to tell you. So basically what happens is Catherine was married to King Henry VIII's brother. All right, now the Pope is going to basically say, you know what, I'll basically annul that marriage that she had to your brother. You guys get married. They got married, but the problem was Catherine could not produce a male heir. She was only producing females. Okay, so for example, Princess Mary Tudor. Henry basically his whole point was, I want a male heir to continue the throne of England. And so he goes back to the Pope and asks Pope Leo X to annul his marriage to Catherine. The Pope will not do it because he has this strong relationship with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Now, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, is the nephew of Catherine. All right, so you can see kind of how, again, the medieval era and how all this worked when we come into the 15 and 1600s. He wants to leave Catherine. He's got to get the Pope to bless it. The Pope won't bless it because the Pope is friends with Charles V. Charles V is Catherine's nephew. All right, so Henry says, you know what? I don't need you to annul this. I'm the king. Right? I'm the sovereign over my land. And I have theologians and priests and bishops that are going to side with me. Now, you know what? We hear about this Protestant Reformation that's taking place. Now, my own personal view here is you have some individuals that are going to be genuinely following and embracing the Protestant Reformation. For example, Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury that served underneath King Henry VIII there in England. Okay, he genuinely was embracing the Reformation. Now, I'm doing some research now, looking into some of his influences on John Wesley, for example, and so Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He is going to he's Henry's religious advisor, and he became a close friend. Well, Cranmer really was trying to reform the Church of England. I think King Henry VIII is trying to use the Reformation as a way to address his political problem, his political issue with the Pope, right? And he says, you know what? I don't need you. I can do this on my own. And so he basically embraces the Protestant reforms of John Wycliffe and Martin Luther. Remember, John Wycliffe is going to be in England. And so basically between 1532 and 1534, the Parliament, okay, the legislative body of England, is going to pass a series of laws, including the November 1534 Act of Supremacy. And that Act of Supremacy basically said the king or the monarchs, the king or queen for future references, the monarch of England is going to not only be the head of state, but he or she will be the head of the church. All right. And officially, they remove themselves, under the influencing leadership of King Henry VIII, they break communion from the Roman Catholic Church. They say, you know what, Pope Leo, we don't need you. We don't need the Roman Pope. We don't need the Roman Pope. We don't need the Church in Rome. We don't need your blessing. We've been a church almost as long as you guys have. We'll just figure this out on our own. And so they break communion with the Roman Catholic Church, and they start taking more of a reformed, a Protestant reformed theology, primarily under the influence of Thomas Cranmer. And there's a lot to that, so read more into that. That's the big thing that you need to know. So when we sit there and we talk about the Church of England throughout their history kind of went back and forth whether they were Protestant or Roman Catholic, really depending on who the king or queen was. Eventually there's going to be a law passed, and we'll talk about this later. Eventually there will be a law passed that says, basically the monarch needs to be Protestant. Okay, there's going to be a point where they say no more Catholics, no more Roman Catholics, and this is going to be a big issue. The Book of Common Prayer that we know that most people might be familiar with, that came from the Protestant Reformed movement of the Church of England underneath Thomas Cranmer. Okay, John Wesley was an Anglican priest within the Church of England, generation removed in the 1700s, and he never left the Church of England. Okay, he is trying to do some more reforms in the Church of England within his Methodist societies, his Oxford Holy Club, when he was attending Christ Church at Oxford University, and so. Again, there's that close relationship between the Methodists and the Anglican churches, and so the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, for example, in our manual says that we do come from that Wesleyan. That's our connection. That's our heritage. Okay, and so. You're going to see some differences there. So be sure to familiarize yourself with the English Reformation, because it's going to play a huge role, especially in the development of American Christianity a little bit later. Okay. and with the colonies and whatnot. All right, that's going to be a huge thing, and we'll talk about that. One other thing that you need to know from the English Reformation is this strange thing that kind of pops up a couple generations later. Okay, a couple generations later from King Henry VIII. You're going to have King James the Sixth or King James the First. He was King of Scotland, the sixth, and then he became when his mom and aunt couldn't produce a male. When his mom and aunt, when his aunt, who was Elizabeth was the direct descendant of King Henry VIII. When there was no male heir produced, he became the next male. He became the next king because he was the next male. He becomes joint. He starts to unite the kingdom. That's why we call it the United Kingdom, right? Started with England and Scotland, eventually Ireland, so on and so forth, until it kind of spread. Great Britain is what they would call it, and then they started to unite the different lands. And so King James the First, as we're going to call him from the English side, he is going to have his own push against some continued reformers that start popping up, and these are the Puritans. Now, the Puritans felt like they needed to purify the Church of England. That they said, you know what, you guys, the Church of England, you're too Roman Catholic. So we feel like we need to purify the church. And there's really two groups that you're going to see. You're going to see the Puritans, and then you're going to see the separatists. Okay, now the Puritans and the separatists, they're two different groups, and you're going to start hearing some of that here in this week and next week, because those are the ones that start coming over to the colonies, right? So for example, in Virginia, Massachusetts, for example, you're going to start seeing a lot of Pilgrims who were separatists, and you're going to see a lot of Puritans. Okay, the Puritans, the difference between the Puritans and the separatists: the Puritans did not want to leave the Church of England. They just wanted to purify it. They felt like, you're too Roman Catholic. Okay, they stayed within the Church of England, and in fact, it was a big deal. That's where there's an English civil war that eventually breaks out with some of the descendants of King James, and that becomes a big problem, which we'll talk about. Then you also have the separatists. And the separatists, if you look at the names, the Puritans wanted to purify, separatists wanted to separate. The Puritans wanted to stay within the Church of England and purify it. They wanted to reform it even more. But then the separatists, they said, nah, you know what? We're not even going to try to reform the Church of England. We're going to separate ourselves from the Church of England. So, for example, the Baptists, okay, that we know and love here in America today, that movement starts in England by a group of separatists. They wanted to separate. Okay, the Pilgrims that come and settle that we all know at Plymouth Rock, right? The Pilgrims are separatists. They're not all Baptists, but they were separatists. They wanted to leave the Church of England. The one that you're gonna have one branch that settles in one part that they wanted to separate. You have another branch that settles in the Massachusetts Bay Area. They wanted to stay. They were the Puritans. Okay, eventually the Puritans take over that whole region. But point is, just know, based out of the English Reformation, you're going to have another two branches, if you will, maybe even three branches that pop out. The Puritans, the Separatists, and within the Separatists, you're going to have the Baptist movement as well. In fact, the great King James Version of the Bible that we all know, right? In 1604, King James I organized a translation committee to says basically, I want the Puritans were really pushing him to do this because they really did not like the Latin Vulgate. They didn't like some of the early English translations because they kind of depended too much on the Latin Vulgate. And so he said, all right, you know what? I'll organize a translation committee and we'll get this worked out. So the King James Version of the Bible was an effort to really kind of appease the Puritans in England, and specifically they wanted to get rid of some of that Catholic influence in the translation of the Bible that they had. And so they wanted to change some of the language, get rid of some of that Roman Catholic translation influence, because there's certain passages, if you look at it, definitely got a Roman Catholic theology behind it. And so they wanted to produce a more Protestant Reformed English version. And you also have the ecclesiology of the Church of England that was completely different from the Roman Catholic Church at that point too. The final edition was printed in 1611. That's the one that we all think of when we think of the King James Version of the Bible. The authorized version of the King James Version of the Bible is 1611. And he is going to also be the person that launches the exploration of the New World. Okay, in 1606, he's going to launch the Virginia Company of London. Those are the Puritans that landed in the Virginia area. And you're going to Jamestown, basically, and you're going to see some pilgrims that are going to go in the Virginia Company of Plymouth, okay, and they're going to go to Plymouth. Now, the Virginia Company of London, they also send some settlers up to Massachusetts. So you have Puritans in Virginia, you have Puritans in Massachusetts, and then you have pilgrims, the separatists, that went to the Plymouth Rock part of Massachusetts. Okay. You're also going to have one more reformer that we need to just briefly mention, and his name was John Knox. Okay, John Knox is going to be a leader in the Scottish Reformation. Again, remember King James the First or King James the Sixth, his same guy, just different names. King James the Sixth was king over Scotland. All right, and you're going to see some of the Scottish. They're going to say, listen, we even have our own way that we feel like we should be doing church, and King James is going to kind of butt up against that. So on one hand, he's got some reformers causing problems in England, and on another hand, he's got some reformers causing some problems in Scotland. And John Knox, through the work of John Knox, you're going to see the emergence of the Presbyterian Church. Okay, Scotland has their own national church. It's the Church of Scotland, right, which is Presbyterian in its model. Every church that we've talked about has a different model or form of government, right? Roman Catholic, Anglican, they are all, even Lutheran, they are all Episcopal. They're Episcopal. They have a bishop, episkopos, okay? They have a bishop that is kind of the head, and they have different groups underneath them, right? And then you have the more congregational, okay? Episcopal, congregational. Congregational is going to be the Reformed churches, right? Zwingli, the Baptist churches, so on as the Puritans, the congregational churches that eventually formed in America. So Episcopal, congregational, and then you're going to have the Presbyterian churches. The Presbyterian churches have councils of elders, right? Presbyter, an elder, right? That's where that word comes from, presbyteros, in the New Testament. So Presbyterians, right, originally from Scotland, we call them Presbyterians because we have the Presbyterian Church here in America. So John Knox is going to help lead that Reformation in Scotland. So just look into that, look into the influence that he's going to have as well. So that's it for the weekly introduction for week 2. Again, just to recap, look at hopefully you've looked at Martin Luther, but you're also going to look at John Calvin. You're going to look at Ulrich Zwingli. You're going to look at Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cranmer and King Henry VIII in England, and then you're going to look at John Knox. All right. For the assignments this week, you're going to be reading chapters 6 through 10, as well as in the Story of Christianity, Volume 2, and from the other Gonzalez textbook, A History of Christian Thought, Volume 3, you're going to be reading chapters 4, 6, and 7, okay? Your weekly discussion board post this week and your spiritual life forum. Don't forget to do those assignments. They're due on the third night of the week, and your initial posts are due on the third night of the week. Your replies are going to be due the last night of the week, okay? Your discussion board question for this week is going to be very heavily centered around John Calvin and his view of the sacraments and specifically baptism. So be sure that you read the documents that are attached to the assignment. That has been linked in some of your other readings. You're also going to have a reading that's why you have more reading about John Calvin this week than you do some other things, because some of the assignments are linked to that. This week, at the end of the week, your first assignment, your first audio reading log is due. Now, the audio reading log, that's different. Maybe some of you guys are not used to that. Basically, this assignment is going to help you be accountable to reading, because there's a lot of reading in this history class, and it's going to help strengthen some of the concepts that you may have read about that we may not have an opportunity to talk about in the course, and it's going to promote your independent reading and research. So you have an option. You can do a video or you could do like a YouTube video or a recorded video or a podcast, an audio, and you need to be doing some reading. So there will be 3 logs throughout the course. Okay, you can do one audio log, audio or video. You can do one audio log, and you can do 2 reading logs. Okay. For this first assignment, I'm not saying you have to turn in all 3. You're gonna just submit one. And so in that audio log, reading log, you're gonna say, all right, I have read or I've listened to this material and it's related to this branch of church history. So it's going to pick up in 1500 to the modern era. So 1500 AD through the modern era. Don't be dipping back into church history 1 like around 500 AD. That was in church history 1. For the reading log, for reading logs 1, 2, or 3, you need to be reading from 1500 to the modern era. Now, your textbooks do count. That is part of the assignment, but you need to be looking at additional reading. And so look at the instructions for that assignment. And be aware that your annotated bibliography is coming up next week. You also have an essay paper that's due next week as well. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to the instructor, and hopefully you'll be good to go. God bless.